Hi, I'm Xin Yi. I'm the curator of PRISM 48. It's a conversation series for this year's Singapore International Festival of Arts. So today I'm here with Irene Ng, who is the author of the biography of Mr. S. Rajaratnam. The first volume is called The Singapore Lion, and the second volume, which came out last year, is called The Lion's Roar. Hi, Irene. So we should tell people that we're doing this online because you live in Scotland.
I'm based in Scotland, yes, but although I travel between Scotland, Singapore, and Malaysia, where my parents live.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
I was born in Penang, Malaysia, but I came to Singapore at the age of 16 to study. And after I graduated from NUS, I joined the Straits Times as a journalist. And I was a journalist for many years until 2001 when I joined politics. But my first love has always been writing. Storytelling is part of my blood. And so when I wrote the biography of S. Rajaratnam, it was really a return to my first love.
And how did you first get the idea that you wanted to write this biography?
Well, when I was a journalist, I covered both local politics as well as regional politics, and that's where I met Mr. Rajaratnam. He was very kind and generous with his time, giving me interviews and background information for my stories. And I suppose he saw in me a young journalist who was trying to do her best to provide useful information. And he's actually a very reserved man, very thoughtful, but you can tell that he's a man whose mind is always about Singapore, about ideas, and he was keen to share with the young journalists the need to think about meaningful ideas. And over time, I noticed that he became more and more absent-minded. He deteriorated with time, especially after he left politics in 1988. So when I noticed that he was deteriorating, I felt that his story deserved to be told. But I didn't conceive at the time that I would be writing a biography. It was only when the last year before he passed away, I felt that stronger impulse, that people should not forget. So even if he might forget because he was losing his memory, people should not forget the role that he played in building Singapore, in being the chief ideologue of Singapore's national identity. And I remember when I visited his wake, I stood in front of his coffin and made a vow to do my best to capture his very complex character as accurately as possible, as comprehensively as possible, but also as fairly as possible, because I know that the last thing he would want is hagiography. So I had to make sure that it could stand the test of scrutiny and the test of time. And I took 20 years to write both. So I hope that those who read it will at least come away saying that I may not have met Rajaratnam, but I know this man.
So I think most Singaporeans will know that Mr. Rajaratnam was one of the founding members of the People's Action Party. He was Singapore's first culture minister and the first foreign affairs minister. But I think they might not know the type of person that he was. So from reading your book, I got a picture of a person who was quite, for lack of a better description, maybe he has a very artistic temperament. So he was quite dreamy, a bit of a loner, head in the clouds a little bit. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what shaped him when he was growing up.
Yes, and I must add to your adjectives, other than being a dreamer, idealist, he was also a radical and a philosopher. And all this also came from how he was exposed to various influences as he grew up. He spent his early formative years in a rubber plantation in Seremban. His father worked as a conductor or a supervisor of a rubber estate in Seremban. Rajaratnam grew up in this very caste-conscious, devout Hindu traditional background in a very cloistered and secluded rural plantation. His world was small, but he was constantly questioning about what his parents believed in. It's something in him that wants to go beyond the confines of his surroundings. So he began reading. He picked up books on philosophy. He picked up books on religion, and he began to question the traditional assumptions of his family that your life is basically mapped out for you based on your bloodline, based on your caste, based on your race, based on where you came from, based on your status in life as inherited. When he went to school, he began to make friends from different races, different cultures. But you see, that doesn't explain it, because there were other people who also were exposed to different cultures and different races. So it took a different type of personality to want to seek out people who are different. And he did. So his best friends in school were not Tamils or Indians or even Malayans. One was an Indonesian Chinese and the other one was a Japanese. So you can tell even from his childhood that he was always seeking to go beyond the confines of the traditional, the expected, wanting to explore new worlds. And through books, he found that he could transcend his surroundings and explore new worlds. And so books was his obsession. The second major influence was when he left in 1935 for London to study law at King's College. And when he was there, he was exposed to an entirely different world. I mean, not only is the surroundings different, but the whole tone and atmosphere were brimming and bustling with politics. Everybody was talking about the socialism, Marxism, communism, anti-colonialism, and these are all concepts that were to him very alien. So he was mixing around with different groups, the anti-colonial groups, the writers, Indians, South Africans, Caribbeans, left-wing socialists, communists. I mean, his group of friends were eclectic. He began to be exposed to different ways of arguing, different ways of reasoning, as opposed to a top-down way of thinking. And he recalled particularly one book launch that left a lasting impression on him. It was a book by an author called Cedric Dover, and the title of the book is Half Caste. Dover said that there's no such thing as a pure race. All of us are mixed races. To him, Rajaratnam, it's mind-blowing, because all along he was brought up to believe that race is fixed and caste is fixed, and therefore the concept of a pure race is like a given. So he began to revise his view, to challenge and question all his traditional assumptions that he inherited from his family, from school. And from then on, he began to be quite anti-racist and began to conceive of a world where race, language, and religion, which he considered as artificial, man-made constructs, could be swept away with reason and rational thinking. And when the Second World War erupted, it was, of course, a very tense time. It was a time full of trauma, because you never know whether that day will be your last day. So he lived in a way that was very precarious, but with a sense of great vulnerability.
And that was around the time, as far as we can tell, right, that he started writing fiction.
As far as we can make out, yes, because his 7 short stories were published between 1941 and 1947. The war broke out in 1939. So before that, from 1935 to 38, he was doing his law degree. He didn't sit for the exam for the first year in 38. Because of the terror of war, he retook the exams in the next 2 years, but he failed. And that was because, not for lack of intelligence, but I think for lack of trying, because he was really caught up in this different world, which he felt was more important, and where he felt that he found his center, he found his meteor. Now he found his calling to be a writer.
So you said that you discovered his literary work as if you were stumbling on a treasure trove gleaming with an array of rare gems, because actually nobody knew that he had this work. So how did you make this discovery? I'm so curious about this.
When I took on the biography project, part of the agreement with the estate at that point was I have full access to his house. And at that point, there were books all around the house, boxes and boxes of private papers, drawers stuffed with papers, and everything was in disarray, full of dust. And so I was just going through his boxes, and in one of the boxes, I found very old volumes of literary magazines. So I was going through, I said, that's the name of Rajaratnam, split in two, because in those days, he identified himself as Raja and separately Ratnam. When I discovered this 7 stories, including some letters of people who have written to him to ask to translate the works, and I found that Forster have talked about a certain Mr Rajaratnam in his talks on BBC radio during the war times, and I also noticed that George Orwell also talked about a Rajaratnam, and I knew that it was our Rajaratnam because it was the same stories that they were referring to. But he never spoke about it. Imagine if you were a friend of George Orwell or a friend of E.M. Forster who have admired your work, you might have mentioned it, isn't it? Especially when you were the first culture minister, But he never did. But that's part of his temperament. He's not the boasting kind.
How did it feel for you when you made this discovery and you were able to verify that, actually there's this whole area of his life that we didn't know about?
The first reaction is his stories really that good? Because we've never really heard about them in Singapore. And to be honest, Singaporeans, maybe also Malaysians, I don't know, tend to look down on your own writers. You tend to think that writers from overseas, especially from England, are superior, and maybe today there's vestiges of this, in our back of our minds. Our own writers can't be that good, But I would tell you that Rajaratnam was really that good. Not only that, I would say that he's the first Malayan writer in the English language that made his mark overseas as a global writer. And my second reaction was, how strange that he had not talked about it, or how strange that his friends like Lee Kuan Yew don't know about it, and how unusual that he didn't himself compile an anthology.
I think that's a good way to enter maybe a few of his stories, since many Singaporeans may not be that familiar with it.
Now, first of all, we must bear in mind the context to his short stories. It was written during the war in London. At that point, the Indian writers are at the forefront of the anti-colonial movement. And so he was mixing around with Indian writers. So when he wrote his first 4 stories during the war, they were set in South Asia. So the first one I chose was Famine. And this one was the one that E.M. Forster praised in his BBC broadcast in 1941. The story concerns a rural community that was being starved by famine and must choose between the rules of its religion and its survival, which ultimately depends on eating cattle, which was considered sacred to Hindus. So it's really a deeper message and theme about dogmatism, about community, which is more important. I'm reading the introduction because it really sets the scene. After the drought came the famine, so that it was like walking out of one nightmare into another, still more fearful. In the rice fields, where the harvest should have rustled, heavy and golden, was only the half-burnt stubble of their crops. The farmers stared at the dust and ruin in their fields and searched one another's faces for an answer, their eyes becoming deep and dull as the days passed by. When the earth failed to provide them with the food they needed, the villagers, good Hindus though they were, slaughtered their cattle. The very thought had nauseated them. They had looked uncomfortably at one another as they contemplated this act of sacrilege. But hunger was an uncompromising tyrant. Now, of course, there's a twist to this story. At one point, there was a man who owned one cow, and the villagers were keen to get their hands on that cow because they were all very hungry and they've run out of food. And so the twist is this man put up a big struggle, did not want his cow to be sacrificed because he was a good Hindu. Should I do a spoiler?
Maybe not. I let people find out for themselves. But it does strike me as a very radical story.
Coming from someone who was raised in a very strict Hindu family is also considered quite a sacrilege, to even contemplate such an idea, let alone make it a central plot for a story. But it basically challenged traditional assumptions.
And the next story you chose was Drought. Why did you choose this one?
Drought was published in 1941 in United States in the Asia magazine, and it was later compiled in a book in 1947 titled A World of Great Stories, 115 Stories, the Best of Modern Literature. The best from all around the world, mind you. And it is striking to me that his name, Rajaratnam, was next to another name, Rabindranath Tagore, who just happens to be Asia's first poet laureate in literature. And there's only two names under India, and it was Tagore and our Rajaratnam. There was no Malaya category, And again, this story has to do with fate, as it were. So in this case, it is drought and someone who had access to a tank of water but would not allow the community to have access to it, and the actions of a boy called Surya, what you would call, I suppose, a radical man who would challenge that. So anyway, I picked this passage because I think it also gave you a sense of Rajaratnam. I suppose it's a bit self-reflective. Physically, he was lean, and his fragile constitution had made him a prey to frequent illness. He stooped like a consumptive when he walked. He was inclined to be taciturn and moody. He read a lot, and whenever he did talk, it was with a passion and vigor incredible in so frail a person. His ideas as they emerged frightened most of the farmers, for he flouted and ridiculed their traditional beliefs with a mocking logic that they could not answer. He talked about rights and justice for the oppressed, but in his heart he bore a profound hatred for men like the Modalia, which passed the understanding of the farmers. Much to their consternation, he called upon them to unite and fight their oppressors. The Modalia is the person who had access to, who had a water tank, which he didn't allow the people to have access to. When Rajaratnam spoke about young men with ideals and who want to challenge the status quo, he also seems to be aware that there's also could be consequences that should be contemplated and that should be weighed and calculated. In this case, it led to tragedy.
For people who never met Mr. Rajaratnam, this reminds you a little bit of a self-portrait of sorts, perhaps?
Maybe not in terms of physically, because he's not fragile, but in terms of being taciturn and moody, I think people would have found him to be so, although they might just use other adjectives like dreamy and quiet and
Okay. And a very strong sort of anti-violent conviction in this story, I find.
Yes, he was against violence and aggression of all kinds.
So the previous two stories were set in what I would say was a kind of, it strikes me as a little bit of a mythical kind of setting. It might be sort of any oppressed environment, more
true.
primitive environment anywhere, right? But the last story you picked, the tiger, we come back to our familiar Malaya.
Yes, that's right. The story was about a pregnant woman called Fatima and her encounter with the tiger while she was having a bath in the river. So this is her perception of the tiger when she first saw it. Framed by the lalang and low to the ground were the massive head and shoulders of the tiger, not more than 20 yards from her. The sun imparted a wicked glint to its staring yellow eyes, and its ears drawn back warningly. It turned its head and snarled, revealing its red tongue, and the yellow fangs looked like tree stumps. So it shows a very imaginative mind, a very confident writer. And of course, one of the major twists is that the tiger did not harm her. But events took a life of its own, and you will read at the end of the story that it ended in a way that is cruel and tragic again. And it makes you, as a reader, think about stereotypes, because there's a stereotype about the tiger. Immediately when you talk about a tiger, you think, oh, it's ferocious, it must be killed. I suppose if you want to have a different layer of meaning, you can transpose that to any human being. Indians are so and so, or Chinese are so and so that can be one layer of interpretation. But there are many others, and he leaves a lot of room for readers to work out how they would interpret the piece and find some universal truths that they can relate to. I think it's a timeless piece.
I think I remember you saying that this was one of his more famous stories, right?
So, The Tiger first appeared in modern reading in the UK in 1942, but it was republished a few times in Malaya and Singapore. It's also translated and used as textbooks in various countries, except Singapore. In Canada, it was used as part of its multicultural studies.
While he was writing all these short stories, he was also freelancing as a journalist, right? Do you want to talk about his earliest piece published in Malaya?
Yes. It's published on 4th November 1939, which is significant because the war started in London in September 1939. So it's just barely 2 months. The top strapline says, telling article written in England. And the headline is, Nazi leader, a small man devoid of dignity. So obviously, Rajaratnam was fervently anti-Hitler, and he wanted to basically rouse the Malayans to the war. It's not merely a distant war in Europe, but it's a war that even people in the Far East should be seized about and worried about because it has to do with human civilization. So he said Hitlerism is the doctrine of revolt against reason and civilization. It is a resurgence to primitive barbarism. And the passage that I thought we can think about is this one. In all of us, despite our veneer of culture, there lurks within us, unknown to us, the hot passions and instincts of an animal and the crude delusions of a savage. To that base and barbaric heritage, Hitler appeals. And then he wrote, can one man destroy the civilized achievements of mankind? We must answer this question and act upon it. We must defeat Hitlerism or sink with it into the primeval swamp of savagery and barbarism. Now, this passage I thought was quite remarkable for several reasons, but the first is that it offers a sense of his reading of human psychology and human nature. That each human being has within him that base instinct that can be exploited, and that evil demagogues can amass great power by appealing to that tribal instinct. And you can see how relevant it is today as well. But it's also remarkable because it's obviously that the piece was written with a sense of moral outrage. So he was driven by moral impulse. And the most obvious level, he was warning people of a dark future. But at a deeper level, it's also asking, urging people to, and maybe to instill in them that sense that you can stop this, and we must act upon it. So you're not a passive observer. You may be far away, you may feel powerless, but we must act upon it. What we didn't know until I did my research is that he was contributing to the war effort using what in those days would be called propaganda, which has today a different connotation, but in those days it's basically championing the values that are upholding freedom as opposed to Hitlerism, which was to him barbarism and savagery, So he was trying to educate people, inspire them, at the same time rouse them to action.
So after the war, he returned to Singapore, and you showed me a 1947 blurb in a local newspaper that said he's shortly to publish a book of short stories when he returned, but that did not happen, and he turned to journalism instead. And he was actually quite a famous journalist, right? And a very controversial journalist.
So when he returned to Malaya, his main vehicles were the English language newspapers, the Malayan Tribune and the Tiger Standard, which was also known as the Singapore Standard. And he basically just channeled his vision for Malaya, his anti-colonialism, his fight for freedom, his struggles against racism, against oppression, injustice. He channeled it into writing as a journalist. And in his columns, he was very, well, today people would say foolhardy, in the sense that he would take on issues and like a dog with a bone, and he wouldn't let go, to the extent that the British governor at the time, Templar, called him up to his office and asked him to sit down and pulled out a drawer and basically showed him that he had a gun. It was basically to intimidate Rajaratnam into softening his tone. But Rajaratnam was not daunted because he believed that he was writing what was important, and he wore his anti-colonial stripes quite proudly. But it was to cost him because eventually he was sacked from Singapore Standard, and to him that's part of the price that he paid.
I was just curious as to why you think he stopped writing fiction. Do you think it was just journalism was more sort of urgently calling to him at that time, or do you have any other speculations on this?
Don't forget that in those days, in the 1940s, when he came back, Malaya was an English literary backwater. Most of the people do not read English books, In fact, I would say the general masses were more comfortable in the vernacular. And at that point also, to be a fiction writer was not considered something serious. You can't make a living from it, for instance, That's why his father was so upset with him, because if he came back with a law degree, at least he could make a living as a lawyer and be assured of a good income. But that was not uppermost in his mind. He wanted to influence minds. He wanted to change the course of history. He wanted to shape the future of the country. And therefore, he channeled it into a form of writing that he knew would reach households, the masses, and that was journalism. There was one column, I thought, that illustrates how he continues to fight for his vision of a non-communal society. This was a column called The Hoax of Communal Solidarity. It was published in 1953. So it just shows you how his views were consistent and was right there from the beginning. So in this column, he attacks communal politics and the leaders that amplify such an approach. And when he used the word communal politics, it covers race, religion, language. So this excerpt that I choose goes like this. In choosing leaders, I would pay no regard to their racial origin. What I'm concerned with is their ability sincerity, and their genuine desire to serve all people of this country. So that's, for him, a race-blind approach to politics. Now, this is an example of some of his earlier columns. He wrote that, to my mind, attests to his role as an iconoclast who confronted the deep divisions between the different races and challenged all sorts of traditional assumptions about race, culture, and language. These were controversial ideas. Not only controversial, but they went against the mindsets and the worldview and the experiences of most people at that time. Because under British Malaya, including Singapore, people lived in their own enclaves. You know, their loyalty was to their kin, their clan, their motherland. They cleaved fervently, you know, to their ethnic identities. And having a communal leader to them is not only normal, it is like, why question it? It's like almost God-given, you know, because that's how they were organized and that's how they survived. So for him to challenge that was it was revolutionary and radical.
In addition to writing for newspapers, he also wrote radio plays in Singapore for Radio Malaya. And there was a particular piece called A Nation in the Making, which you quoted quite extensively in the biographies.
Now, the radio plays that he wrote were very creative projects that were aimed at provoking his listeners to think about what binds a nation together. And in his 6-part A Nation in the Making, he delved into the sensitive issues of race and religion and appealed to their reason. And he did this at a sensitive period when Malaya was preparing itself for independence from the British. The program was aired from 11 July to 15 August 57. The Federation of Malaya became independent on its own on 31st August 57. So he was writing this with an eye on independence on the horizon, preparing the people for independence and trying to convince them that you can make a nation out of your diversity. At that point, when he wrote it, he believed or hoped that Singapore would be part of an independent Malaya. So he said, everyone on this island, if you trace back far enough in the history, all of us came from somewhere else. So if you read the play carefully, it actually challenges a lot of the fundamental assumptions of what makes Malaya. And I think the same questions can be asked today of Singapore, you know, with the new waves of immigrants coming in, and with each new generation of immigrants, what sort of Singapore are we today? What sort of society do we want to be? What sort of values do we have? What sort of national identity? These are all the same issues that he grappled with in 57 and still is relevant today. So the excerpt that I thought we can discuss is from A Nation in the Making, Part 6. It goes like this. All that the people of Malaya need is the will to be a nation. The will to be a nation can come only if the people see themselves not as the product of the history of China or of India or of Europe, but as a product of the Malayan history we have been helping you to discover. Now, when he said we have been helping you to discover, it's because he used characters basically to have dialogue with each other. If he had done it in a speech or in a column, it would sound very pedantic, but he tried to inject humor in his plays whilst trying to get across the points for people to think about, you know, to make up their own minds. But I think it's remarkable that Mr. Rajaratnam had imagined a nation united by a common will and a national consciousness which transcends the divisive concepts of race, ancestry, and religion. Even before the outward shelf the outward shell of independence was formed.
So quite shortly after this play was broadcast, I guess he became a full-time politician. And I think what struck me about A Nation in the Making was also there was this dialogue between the optimist and the pessimist that he sort of imagined. And I wondered if once he entered into politics, this dialogue between the optimist and the pessimist became much more than a creative technique. It really is like life is this dialogue now, right? All these forces between optimism and pessimism during this very tumultuous part of history. So I'm just going to quickly read some of the accomplishments that he was associated with during his time as the culture minister. So he was culture minister from 1959 to 1965. And during that time, he started the Aneka Ragam Rakyat People's Cultural Concerts, which featured multicultural performances. So these kinds of performances became very, 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 very common in Singapore. But at that time, it was quite unusual. And the point was to sort of help people of different cultural backgrounds get to know each other better, right?
These cross-cultural productions in those days were considered an anathema. It is to the audience at the time, it is completely uncomfortable. So there were people already criticizing him for it. But he persevered because he wanted to expose people to the idea of multiculturalism. And it's important for me to be clear at this point that for him, the concept of multiculturalism is quite a unique and distinct one. It is not about the different cultures coexisting together on this island. It is about the different cultures coming together to create a shared national identity to which all would give their primary loyalty. So it's a totally different concept. For Rajaratnam, this concept of multiculturalism is a fusion that you would willingly and be consciously create a national identity that's forged from this constant interaction, this constant engagement, and this openness to different cultures and different ways of living and thinking.
And then he launched the National Theatre, which he envisioned as a showcase for a Singapore culture that was rooted in many civilizations, but would eventually take on an identity of its own. So that was really at the very, very nascent stage of Singapore culture. And then in 1963, at the opening of the National Theatre, he launched the first Southeast Asia Cultural Festival, which was the largest event of this scale at the time. And a precursor to SIFA, perhaps. And I just wanted to, this part of your book really was very cathartic for me. So I just want to quickly read that while he was doing all these things, there was a letter from a citizen who wrote him and said the government is spending too much money on the arts. So this letter said, which is more important, houses, schools, jobs and hospitals, or music, painting, literature and drama? To which Mr. Rajaratnam replied, this is the sort of question that is asked in societies which are spiritually and intellectually sick. Such a question comes naturally only in a society which has become less human and almost animal in character. Was this printed? Was this a public answer?
Yes. His language was quite masculine.
Wow.
I think today, if you say that, you'll get buried in violent tirade.
That is incredible.
Yes, he calls it as he sees it. In those days, Singapore was still a third world backwater, and its main survival was through trade. They couldn't build enough houses. People were living in slums, in very poor sanitation. There's no electricity in many places. So very basic needs have not been met. So the question, of course, is which is more important, but Rajaratnam, with his vision on the future and his emphasis on the intangibles, on creating the sort of character, sort of society that he envisions would be a better than that of an animal, which are only concerned with keeping the body and soul together, right? So, of course, upon joining Malaya in 63 to form Malaysia, the 2 years in Malaysia were traumatic because immediately the issues of race, language, and religion came to the forefront. Race politics were all consuming, and Singapore's non-communal vision, his ideology of non-communal politics were being attacked at every turn. And it was to his horror and everlasting regret that because of all the struggles and all the battles that he put up, including the PAP leaders put up, fighting for this vision of Malaysian Malaysia, the Tunku had enough, expelled Singapore. And for Rajaratnam, it was a moment of great torment because all the signs were pointing to not only that Singapore would not survive, but that the non-communal vision was a casualty of it. Would Singapore be able to fulfill this non-communal vision by itself? Because already, as soon as independence was announced, as soon as Singapore was expelled, communal politics were coming to the fore again. But it's remarkable that even with all this, with this evidence of things fraying, of things falling apart in front of his eyes, he could appear in front of the United Nations as Singapore's first foreign minister and declare to the world the bold vision of Singapore being a successful multiracial society that will be a model to the rest of the world.
This is from his 1965 speech at the United Nations.
Yes.
We think of ourselves not as exclusively a Chinese, Indian, or a Malay society, but as a little United Nations in the making. The four cultures which flourish in my country collectively represent the historic achievement of more than half of humanity, and we see no reason for suppressing other cultures in order to ensure the supremacy of only one of them.
I mean, that's how much he believed in it. He had faith in Singapore, he had faith in the future, and it was for him an act of will for him to stand up and tell the world that Singapore would be a successful multicultural model and that by its existence it would serve a useful purpose. So Singapore is not surviving for the sake of surviving. By its very survival, it could lend hope to a world that's riven by divisions of race, language, and religion.
So in 1966, Mr. Rajaratnam wrote the National Pledge, which you write was introduced in most depressing circumstances. Can you share more about these circumstances?
That was mere months after the separation from Malaysia in August 65. And during that period, the trauma of separation was still lingering, was still strong. There was still concerns about how Singapore was going to survive. There was no industrial base, there was no defense, there was hardly any natural resources. Housing was desperate. Race relations was at an all-time low, a legacy from the race riots in 64, which continued to fester. And so the circumstances were depressing. And not only that, the political situation was highly unstable. The pro-communist opposition party, the Barisan Sosialis, and its unions were mounting strikes and protests on the streets, and the communal demagogues and the race-based political parties, they were seizing the moment to make demands on behalf of their racial base. So the nightmare scenario, which haunted Rajaratnam especially, was what if, given the external pressures and domestic pressures, Singaporeans respond not as citizens, not as Singaporeans, but as Malays, Chinese, Indians, and others. Because that, if they do that, then it will be ethnic bloodshed again and anarchy. And not only that, there was also the danger of more race riots instigated by external forces. And he knew all too well how easily these emotions could be whipped up. So when you bear in mind this backdrop of fear and desperation, it seems all the more remarkable that Mr. Rajaratnam could find the strength and the conviction to draft the words of the National Pledge.
And it's also quite interesting that in this time of great uncertainty, that the pledge was something that they wanted to be written, right? So it was actually, the idea actually came from the Education Ministry, and there were already 2 drafts of it by other people circulating before the request came in for Mr. Rajaratnam to draft something. So when you look at the earlier 2 drafts and the one that he came up with, what strikes you about his version?
Well, to be clear, when the Education Ministry asked Rajaratnam's help to draft the words, it is actually for an oath of allegiance to the flag. It wasn't something they envisioned as something is called the National Pledge. And the wordings of the previous 2 drafts were meant to be recited to the flag as a way to express their national loyalty. But when Rajaratnam took over the task, he reimagined it. So it was not an oath to the flag. It became an oath to one another, to fellow citizens. So we have to be clear that while the idea was from the Education Ministry, he reimagined it as something more. What stood out for me? 2 things. If I may read out his version, we as citizens of Singapore pledge to forget differences of race, language, and religion and become one united people, to build a democratic society where justice and equality will prevail and where we will seek happiness and progress by helping one another. So his use of the word forget, to me, is very significant because it shows his intended meaning behind the phrase, regardless of race, language, or religion. It means transcending your differences. It means disregarding your divisions. It means casting aside your age-old prejudices. Now, it's important to be clear that it doesn't mean forget your cultural history or your cultural heritage or your cultural identity. He's not saying you have this collective amnesia. What he's saying is that when you make your stance as Singaporeans, what comes first in your mind is your identity as a Singaporean. You forget you're Chinese, you forget you're Indian, you forget you're Malay, you are Singaporean. That comes first. So that was his intended meaning, which was in the final version, frankly, is more lyrical, the final version. But I think if you read it together with his draft, you can tell that the meaning behind the regardless of race, language, or religion is this sense of forgetting. And I must stress that he has used the phrase regardless of race, language, or religion many times in his speeches before he wrote the pledge as well. So it's a phrase that he has used very liberally, but the way he phrased it shows what he meant by it. The second thing that struck me is where he says to build a democratic society where justice and equality will prevail and where we will seek happiness and progress by helping one another. We know the final version, but his version stresses the kind of democracy that we are building, the kind of democratic system and values that we have in Singapore is like this. One that's centered on justice and equality, and one that is focused on the bonds of collective responsibility and mutual help. So it's not individual. So that's why the second phrase where he says to achieve happiness and progress by helping one another. So as opposed to helping oneself, as opposed to helping one's family, as opposed to helping one's clan and community. So that sense of equality, of mutual support is intrinsic to his understanding of being Singaporean. The final version has also the words happiness, prosperity, and progress, but it's but the way they phrase it, the emphasis is different. And also, it is in one sentence, when you read it, the final version, it is like the end of being a united society, regardless of race, language, and all that, is so as to achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress for our nation. So it's like all this is to achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress for our nation. But for Rajaratnam, achieving happiness and progress is a legitimate aim, but it's how you achieve it that makes you uniquely Singaporean.
Interesting. I just realized right now that the final version added prosperity.
Yes, it does. Although Rajaratnam have always talked about prosperity as well, because he knew it was important for progress, But it was not for him. I suppose it wasn't in his draft. So I suppose there were other considerations that were weighing on him at that point in time.
I guess one of my questions was arising from your book, actually, because in the foreword to volume 1 of Mr. Rajaratnam's biography, there was a foreword by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in which he wrote, I tightened his draft of the pledge, he means, to leave out the more idealistic phrases and to smoothen it. So I was very intrigued by this. What happened between the draft we know Rajaratnam wrote and the final version?
Now, this sentence that you quoted is in his foreword in volume 1 of the biography, The Singapore Lion. He wrote the foreword in 2009. Now, that's many decades after 1966. So what I always do, I always double check against historical records, because even oral interviews, I will always check, because people can misremember. So in this case of the pledge, Lee Kuan Yew wrote that in his foreword to me for volume 1. But when I wrote about the drafting of the pledge in volume 2, I made clear that there's no available record that showed that Mr. Lee had a hand in drafting the pledge. But that said, Mr. Lee did put in extraordinary efforts to try and persuade teachers and principals to promote the pledge in their schools, because in the initial years, especially, there was resistance to using the pledge in schools. And also, we also have to be clear that when Mr. Lee said that he thought that the words in the pledge was idealistic, and this is something that Mr. Lee have repeatedly said over the years, including in Parliament. He always felt it was a dream too far, but he went along with it because Rajaratnam believed so strongly in it. But he framed it in his mind, Mr. Lee, as an aspiration. That means it's something in the future, something to aspire for. But for Rajaratnam, when he wrote it, as well as for the rest of his life, the pledge is exactly what it is. It is a promise. It's a promise that you make to one another. It's something real and present. It's something that you would live to every day. And in his conception, people don't die for aspirations that may or may not be achieved, right? But you would die for a way of life. You would die for an idea for which your entire nation is based on. So for him, it's more than aspiration. It is conviction. It is an ideal to fight and die for.
Interesting. So the difference to you that you make between an aspiration and a promise is that a promise binds you?
Yes, and binds you to one another. Because we as citizens of Singapore, because when you pledge yourself as one united people. You're pledging to each other, You're pledging yourself to the nation, but also to each other as fellow citizens. So it is a promise to be kept. And if you want to examine the premise behind that, it's because Rajaratnam believed that race, religion, language are essentially man-made constructs. So you can override them. You can choose by an act of will, an act of faith, to overcome these boundaries, the differences. But Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had a more primordial and genetic view of racial differences, where it's in the blood. So it's hard to remove it. It's hard to disregard it. And therefore, for Mr. Lee, it follows that it's an aspiration because it's not immediately realistic. For Mr. Rajaratnam, because he believes in the power of the human will, you can overcome it. You believe, you act on it, and it is a deliberate choice.
So, although the pledge was written in 1966, it was not until 1996 that we actually found out that Mr. Rajaratnam was the author of the pledge. So this was revealed at an event by Mr. Lee, and it was actually quite an emotional reveal. He teared up at the words, "One united people, regardless of race, language, and religion." And he said, "Don't believe that the words race, language, and religion are just words. They have deep emotional tones that tug at you and make you do things your common sense tells you you should not do." And then, as you mentioned just now, he felt that the phrase, regardless of race, language, and religion, was a dream too far, but he still said, "Why not?" And I was very, very struck by this response because I think all artists in Singapore know that Mr. Lee is the one who said poetry is a luxury we cannot afford. But in this case, it seems as if to build a nation, you have to start with, or to build this nation, you have to start with words. And you have to start with, if you think of the pledge as a piece of poetry, it is a condensation of a lifetime of ideals. I was just thinking, what do you make of this reveal from Mr. Lee? Why was it so emotional for him, you think?
Well, I was there actually. I was there covering the event as well. So I saw the entire emotional outpouring from him because he actually choked when he spoke about it. He was asked by a member of the audience during the Q&A, why did he choke when he said he remembered that Rajaratnam wrote the pledge and the regardless of race, language, or religion was such important words. And then Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said that it reminded him of how when he had lost hope or when he had lost faith and times were bleak, it was Rajaratnam that gave him the heart to carry on, gave him the heart to fight on. So when we talk about the power of words, the power of ideas, it is something that will bubble up in you when you are almost like totally desperate without any hope. And you need people around you to also remind you to be unwavering, to hold fast, and you need a team like that. So if Mr. Lee Kuan Yew did not have this Mr. Rajaratnam with his ideals and ideas and his power over words and over this sense of human will, then I think for Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, it will be quite a different sort of leadership journey. And you may not have the kind of Singapore that we have today. But Mr. Rajaratnam gave him a lot of heart. And while Mr. Lee Kuan Yew would sometimes seem to dismiss the more idealistic streak that Mr. Rajaratnam brings to discussions, I know that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew appreciates the fact that Mr. Rajaratnam is a man of conviction and never wavers, and who believed in Singapore when nobody else did. People always see Mr. Lee Kuan Yew as this strong, realistic, even strict leader. But Mr. Rajaratnam saw a different side of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, a man who was doing his best and have seen his hopes dashed again and again, and who needed someone who believed in him, believed in Singapore, believed in what they fought for. And Mr. Rajaratnam was always the keeper of the multiracial flame. So I think that's important to bear in mind, how this dynamics of the relationship is part of what made Singapore special.
You could almost say a conversation between the optimist and the pessimist.
Very right.
My final question is, we don't know so many things, right, about what he wrote. So now it has come to the light that he was a writer of fiction. He was a writer of The Pledge. What difference does this make that we know this now? And what do you hope Singaporeans young Singaporeans especially, can take away from knowing this fuller picture of his life?
Well, to answer that question, maybe I can tell you a story. Now, Mr. Rajaratnam, right till the end of his life, was championing his vision of a Singapore in Singapore. And there were ups and downs. There were moments in his life when he thought all was lost, and he was shattered, and he recovered, and he refurbished his dreams through stories to himself and true stories to the nation. And to him, it does not matter who originates the stories. That's why he never boasted about his short stories. He never boasted about being the principal author of the National Pledge. To him, it's not getting the glory for writing it. For him, it is for what the ideas represent and whether they have made a better Singapore. So when I met him in his final years, by that time he was quite weak. He had suffered a series of minor strokes. His voice was quiet, but I could still see the flame in his eyes. I could see the burning passion for the ideas. And his concern always was that this idea of a Singapore in Singapore would over time be eroded. That a weak government might come in place and might give in to communal pressures. That the people might blindly vote for those who appeal to their base instinct. Remember what he wrote in 1939 about Hitler, about the base instinct that politicians can appeal to. Worried about tribal wars around the world that could spread to Singapore because we're all globalized and we're all interconnected. And so when I looked at him, frail, but so strong and passionate in his beliefs, to me, that represents the power of ideas, the power of storytelling, the power of the human will. And for him, it's never a matter of reciting the pledge. It was something real, something present, something emotional, a moral imperative. So we may forget everything else. We may forget who drafted the pledge, but don't forget this. Now, Singapore was founded essentially on one idea. And that idea was encapsulated in the Singapore National Pledge. So I think when we talk about the draft of his National Pledge, or when we talk about his short stories and the implicit meanings, or we talk about his radio plays, I think it's useful for us to sit back and see the full journey of his life from a restless student who was still discovering his path, who was writing because he believed writing was a way to change the world around him, who came back to Singapore because he believed that he could have a better society and use his skills as a writer and journalist to shape opinions, to create a better society, and then joining politics and using his skills as a writer, as a narrator, as a powerful, imaginative mind to encourage Singaporeans to reimagine their own future. There's always one quote that I hold close to me because this is his mantra. The only thing you can be certain about in this otherwise uncertain world is that the past is unchangeable. The present will disappear in a moment, but there will always be a tomorrow to be shaped. You can make the tomorrow you want, provided you have the wisdom, the guts, and the will to struggle for it. So that was his mantra that he applied to himself and that he quoted to young Singaporeans to help to inspire them to take ownership of their future.
That's a perfect note to end on. To listen to more conversations for PRISM 48 for this year's SIFA, please check out sifa.sg.